Good afternoon, Fighting Scots. My name is Jordan Sharpie-Lencioni, and I am the Associate Director of Alumni Engagement here at Monmouth College. I just want to welcome you this afternoon for our next Golden Scots event, Going to the Moon, from attacking corporate crime to playing live gigs with Bill Mockased, class of 1973. We're so thrilled that everyone's able to join us this afternoon. Before we begin to cover just a few housekeeping items, today's event will be recorded and posted on the Monmouth College website next week. For the best viewing experience during the presentation, please select speaker mode, which you can find in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Attendees can ask questions and use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. And then at the end of today's presentation, we will open up the room so that you can enable your video and sound to have a live conversation with Bill. At the end of the event, you'll also see a short 3-minute survey pop up in your web browser, and then you'll receive a more comprehensive survey next week once the Golden Scots celebration has concluded. Now, for a little bit about our presenter today. Bill Mockased is a professor emeritus of management at Western Illinois University, where he was named a distinguished faculty lecturer in 1992 for his lecture, Corporate Crime and Violence, Should the Boss Go to Jail? He earned his Bachelor of Arts from Monmouth College in 1973 and his Juris Doctor from Valparaiso University in 1977. Bill is a researcher and author in the field of corporate and white-collar crime, as well as a legal consultant on corporate criminal liability in the United States and abroad, including England, Nigeria, and the Netherlands. He also served as a special deputy prosecuting attorney in the landmark Ford Pinto corporate homicide case. Bill has been a recipient of federal and research grants from National Endowment for the Humanities and National Institute of Justice. In addition to his professional career, Bill is well known within his community. He's the founder of the Macomb Unplugged Community Concert Series from 1993 to 2002, where all proceeds were donated to area charitable and nonprofit organizations. He also is a co-founder and chair of the Al Sears Jazz Festival, which ran for 15 years, ending in 2016. Bill has been a volunteer for the Loaves and Fishes Food Pantry for the past 20 years and is also an instructor of Tai Chi and Qigong at the Free Range Yoga and Community Center. Bill serves on the board of directors for the Wesley Village Retirement Community in Macomb, and he is married to Jean Mockased Wolf, the most generous and courageous person he's ever known. Bill, the floor is now yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jordan, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. Since I'm going to be talking about music and its relationship to my seeking happiness in retirement, I'm going to begin with a live song, or at least a part of a song. You may or may not remember this song. This was written by Carole King, and has been recorded not only by her, but by many different groups. So I'm going to try to make sure at least some of the lyrics get out to you. It's called Going Back.
Think I'm going back to the things I learned so well in my youth. Think I'm returning to the days when I was young enough to know the truth. Now there are no games to only pass the time. No more electric trains, no more trees to climb. Thinking young and growing older is no sin, and I can play the game of life to win. I can recall the time when I wasn't ashamed to reach out to a friend. Now I think I've got a lot more than just my toys to lend. Now there's more to do than watch my sailboat glide, and every day can
going to move the computer over to the table so I can sit down and talk with you that way. Although I've had my share of Zoom meetings for sure, I am, somewhat, oops. Did I just lose you? No, there we go. Okay. I'm no pro, but I'll do the best I can here. Well, thanks for your interest in what I have to say. And basically what I'd like to talk about is basically a little reflection on finding happiness in retirement. And I chose that song, Going Back by Carole King, because she, in the lyrics, it talks about going back to certain values and certain sense of wholeness, perhaps at a younger age. And research seemed to indicate that this is not uncommon, especially for men at a certain age, definitely after 40, often after 50, sometimes after 60, to go back to something that provided happiness or a sense of wholeness when they were younger. And so for me, it was music. I performed popular music, basically rock and soul music, when I was in high school up at Aurora West High School here in Illinois. And really started in junior high and did some at Monmouth as well. I want to show you here, first of all, this is a group that I was in at that time. In fact, the two of us went to Monmouth College. Greg Ellis, Dr. Greg Ellis now, he and I were in the group, and we both ended up at Monmouth College. This group, which is called the Shadowcasters, we recorded in high school two 45s, two singles, and which means 4 songs. And it turns out that 2 of them have been anthologized, of course, not with our permission. They just went ahead and copied them into, into their collection. One was a record company in London, England, and another one out of Seattle, Washington. And just kind of a garage band anthologies, lesser known groups, because we weren't a big hit. I mean, we were known around Aurora and the surrounding area, but we weren't a popular act except in our own minds. And so we lasted a while, but so it kind of surprised us for sure to find out that 2 of them were thought up well enough to be anthologized. We did have one song on, for those of you that might remember Dick Clark's American Bandstand show, which was from Philadelphia on Saturdays. We had one on there where they rated the records. Some of you may remember that. Played 2 songs and let a couple of the kids, dancers in there, decide what they wanted to rate them. And so we did. That was probably our highlight in our whole high school career there. Now back to music and the connection that it has for me today, that I've been developing. It reminds me of Professor Sam Thompson. I don't know how many of you remember him, a professor of philosophy at Monmouth College. And in our study of Aristotle, the concept of happiness is very, very central to Aristotle's perception of what it means to live a good life. And happiness is defined not simply by finding peace or abstractly like that, or seeking pleasure, but rather participating in something that provides a fulfillment. That's basically what his concept of happiness is about, to simplify it. And so it seems that I'm not sure we ever stop seeking participating in things that provide a sense of fulfillment. my wife and I really, who was also a professor and retired a few years after I did, we really wanted to, in our retirement, we wanted to go beyond um, the standard conversation about grandkids, travel, and health problems. When I'm sure you've been involved in many of those conversations, nothing wrong with them, but I think retirement can be so much more than that. Um, so let me back up to my time at Monmouth College, which was 1969 to 73. I sang in the concert choir, auditioned for, was selected to perform with the concert choir, but I only lasted one term because I got into a snit with the Professor Griffith, who was the choir director at that time. He had a rule of if you missed a rehearsal for whatever reason, just about any reason, you had your grade lowered one whole grade. If you were late, it went down half a grade. Well, early in the term, I forgot a rehearsal, forgot about it, and I was very, very angry about it. I could not convince him. I'd say I would work in the music library as long as you want, but please don't hit my grade average. Well, it did. So I did end up leaving the choir after buying a tuxedo for our performances, by the way. I also performed in the coffee house, semi-regular basis in the college union. And so I did continue my interest in music when I was Monmouth. More recently, in 3 Golden Scott weekends for the classes of 67, 68, and 69, I performed and told some stories to the donor breakfast group at Monmouth College, the summers of, again, that would have been 17, 18, and 2019. And what I tried to do there was connect certain songs, select songs from those years, from their year of graduation, and make a connection. For example, an old Box Top song called The Letter. Give me a ticket to an airplane, ain't got time to take a fast train. My baby bought me a letter, or sent me a letter. And my memories of, one of my strong memories of Monmouth College, you're away from home, you're waiting to get mail. And so that sense of, exhilaration when you get a letter from someone that you really want to get a letter from. Another song I would perform, I know I performed Bob Dylan songs. And I remember back in an English class at Monmouth College, I asked if I could write an essay about, a popular song by Bob Dylan, and not really expecting to get approval, but I did. And then I would say, well, Monmouth was so ahead of the game because here, these 50 plus years later, Bob Dylan wins the Nobel Prize for Literature. So anyway, that's some of my continuing connection with Monmouth and music. Now, just a little bit about my career, very little bit. It was somewhat non-traditional, I think, in a sense of someone with a law degree. I had just barely graduated when my brother, who was a local prosecuting attorney elected in Elkhart County, Indiana, decided to take on the Ford Motor Company over their design and production and failure to recall the Ford Pinto automobile. And he pretty much had to put together with the limited funds and taking on a behemoth at that time, a very, very large corporation, top 10, top 5 at that time in the country. He had a mostly volunteer staff. And so I ended up working on that case. And that really made all the difference in my career which was to continue working in that field, writing, and ended up teaching here at Western Illinois University in Macomb. I wrote, I taught, I consulted in the area of corporate and white collar crime. I was very career obsessed during most of the 80s and perhaps into the early 90s, working on books and journal articles in this rapidly developing area of legal doctrine, which was how do we hold corporations criminally responsible for their actions, and when should we? And what about individual officers? So that area was developing quite a bit. And so I ended up working on some cases, and here also a case in England. And finally, my retirement, it was time for me to retire in 2009. And I wanted to put a closure to that part of my life. And so I took on, wasn't a case, it was a consulting, large-scale consulting job over in Nigeria, in Abuja, the capital of Nigeria. And so at that point, I said, that's it. I don't really want to do this stuff anymore. I want to move on to other things and see what my wife and I could be doing in our retirement. I was definitely ready for something different. Shortly after retirement, I got involved in a school. It's called the Living School at the Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And they offered, they just started up the school. They offered a 2-year study exploring basically how to live a reflective, a contemplative life balanced with being active in your own community, however you define it, however wherever you find it, however you define it. So I applied for it and was one of 180 students around the world, basically, that were involved. Most of the education was reading and online lectures and so forth, and application in your community. And so at the end of the 2 years of study, there was something called an integrative project, where you applied what you've learned to some project in your community. What I chose to do was to interview residents of a local comprehensive care retirement community, all the way from retirement to healthcare, including memory care and rehab and so forth. And basically sit down, record the interviews. And the subject of the interviews was basically asking these senior citizens, what does it mean to you to live a good life? What does it mean? And I had, a number of questions that I would follow, basically a template in every interview. All but one of the interviews were conducted at the kitchen table, wherever they lived, wherever we could set up. And then what I did was have them transcribed, edited them lightly, and then bound them as a short book with a few photographs, and then distributed them to family members, to the local library, to the university archives, to regional museum. Some churches were interested in it. And so that was my project. And this experience really led me to understand just how important stories were to people in making sense of their lives, and in the importance of sharing those stories, especially in your later years. And so I started, even though I had played some music before then, I started being much more regular in sharing my music and stories with local retirement communities here. during this, I developed a habit of generally arriving early and staying late and sitting down to hear their stories, not just mine, not just my songs. And for example, there's one retirement community. A fellow came up in his wheelchair afterwards, and we sat down and talked for about 10 minutes. And he shared some things about, what the songs meant to him and memories that that came up listening to my music. And after about 10 minutes or so, he wheeled away, and I said, "I'll see you next time." "Yeah, okay." And then the social director for that group, that home, came up and said, "Well, that was interesting." And I said, "What's that?" And she said that he hadn't talked to anybody for at least a month or so. And but the power of music really, I don't know anything about music therapy. I haven't studied it. I know it's a field. I know it's a growing field, and now I understand why. But that was definitely music therapy going on at that moment. So eventually, I became very comfortable playing either solo or with others, a wide range of music, from jazz to old country to still love 60s and early 70s rock and roll and soul music. And I play in wine shops, I played country clubs, and special events, receptions, so forth, parties. And I try to, where it's appropriate, I try to share stories wherever I'm performing. And I found that people are really hungry for that kind of context because music surrounds us. Younger, we used to kind of make fun of elevator music. Well, now there's elevator music or popular music everywhere. Just putting in earbuds, carrying your phone around. You can't escape it, it seems like. And so I think people are hungry for a little deeper connection with the music rather than simply, straight entertainment. The During COVID, I had started using my performances, particularly at one local venue where I've played the last Friday of the month for about 10 years now. I've been donating my pay and all of the donations, and we really push donations both online because every concert is streamed online, and people that arrive, that attend, which is larger now, thankfully, we're opening up. All of that money goes to different nonprofit groups. And I found Macomb despite the university being here, Macomb is a small, fragile community, like most small communities. And many needs became very, very apparent after COVID hit, during COVID. And so I've been able to raise, some cases more than others, some cases surprisingly large amount of money for different programs, some dealing with food delivery for kids as well during the summer, as well as home delivery for others, for families in need. One of the local child care facilities had a fire, and they served, it was income based, so they served some of the poorer members of the community. And with that fire, we held a very, very successful fundraiser and allowed people to donate toys and books and so forth at that concert. The Macomb Arts Center, the Western Illinois Museum, WIU Student COVID Emergency Fund, Project Santa for the holidays, and many, many others during that time. So part of my mission has become really raising money for nonprofit organizations doing good work in the community. The other has been trying to showcase younger musicians and underrepresented musicians from minority groups and allow them, either play with them or have them perform on their own. Mixing amateurs with professional musicians. We have a very strong music program at the university, and I found they love to work with amateur musicians of all types and younger musicians. A couple in in April, the end of April, I put together something called When Soul Meets Country. And with so much attention being given in the country, including in our community, to racial tensions and just racial issues that have come up, I thought it would be very interesting to ask a number of my African American musician friends if they would be willing to come out and sing a country tune, however they want to define it. To choose a country song or a couple of country songs and perform them, quote, in a soulful manner, however they wanted to define that. So we had music, we had spoken word, and it was a very, very successful event, just bringing people together, mixed audience racially and age-wise, and getting past this notion of you having Black music and white music. I also, as an MC, I didn't perform, but as an MC, I also tried to bring a little bit of the history and the African-American influence in country music, which we don't very often recognize. So that's just one example of the special kind of programs you can put together. Now, I guess I'll conclude by, I kind of asked myself, are there any lessons for others? This is kind of an odd, perhaps way that I've approached and developed in my retirement years. I think there might be. I think there are so many ways that, with some imagination in particular, so many ways of contributing to one's own community. The easiest way, of course, is still very important, is providing and donating money to the nonprofit groups that are doing important work. But there are other options. Agreeing to serve on boards, committees, organizations of nonprofit groups that serve the community. Contributing or continuing to contribute your professional or experiential skills to the community. Whether it's a plumber, doctor, lawyer, engineer, teacher, contractor, musician, whatever, there are ways that you can contribute within that community. How can the community use your talents? I would recommend that you find and share perhaps or try something new, or looking back at your younger years, as I did, to find something that provided you with joy, provided you with happiness, a sense of wholeness. And don't be afraid to try and fail, make some mistakes. If it's not working out, try something else. And create relationships. You can create new friendships, no matter how late in life. The people that you share some passion with. And I guess I would close by saying, using a passage that's very important to both my wife and I, and that is this from Saint Benedict. Listen with the ear of your heart. Listen with the ear of your heart. Listen to others. Take time to allow people to tell you their stories. And that includes including your spouse, significant other, your friends, your neighbors. And perhaps that way you can also come
to make a real difference simply by listening. We sometimes don't take enough time to do that. And that's one thing I do like about living in a small community, is that you have more time than you would likely have in an urban area. The maintenance costs of and the pace of life in a smaller community allows you to develop those relationships over time and to really commit to those relationships. So I think that's pretty much all I've got to say. I haven't really been watching the clock, but are we about on time here, Jordan?
Yeah, we're doing great on time. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and promote everyone so that they can turn on their camera if they would like to ask any questions or just carry on a conversation. Let's see here. And to all of our attendees, feel free to just ask whatever questions you might have. If you're not comfortable being on camera or speaking, you can always type it in the chat and then I can read it aloud to the group.
Great, thanks, Jordan.
Absolutely. All
And, you know, they don't have to be questions. They could, I'd love to hear, again, getting back to what I was talking about, listening to perhaps other people's stories about, you know, things that have made a difference in their own lives. And maybe, you know, especially after retirement. Are we all in retirement years here? The people joined, I think. Yeah, that's what
yeah,
I
I think
thought.
most are.
Yeah.
Awesome. Judy, I see you raised your hand. Did you have a question or a comment or any remarks?
You're muted.
Oh, yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, I just wanted to share, I have a very lovely memory of you. My freshman year, the very beginning of my freshman year, I went over to the Theta Chi house on a weekend for a party. I stayed about 5 minutes. I realized it was not my scene. And I wandered out on my own and I heard music coming from Fulton Hall. And my recollection is that you were head resident of Fulton Hall at that time. And I heard you singing some Neil Young songs like Horse with No Name. And I wandered in and I was invited to sit down and I just had a lovely evening. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
Oh,
and I could relate to some of the thing about
yeah, Neil Young. I was a big Neil Young fan back then. Absolutely. My voice was higher too.
So that was a lovely evening. And I can relate to some of the things you said about retirement because I really floundered my first couple of years. I had been a high school teacher, and after I retired, I kept waiting for a bell to ring to tell me what to do. And finally, I went back to one thing that had given me joy earlier in my life, another version of it. I went back to dancing. And then I also started something that I had never done before, and that was theater. And both those things came together within 5 days of each other. And I haven't looked back and things have been good. So I can relate to what you say about connecting with something that gives you joy. So thank you for that.
Oh, that's, yeah, that is fantastic. Yeah, well, wonderful.
Your story reminds me of one of my favorite things about consulting. I did business management consulting for about half my career, 15 years or so at IBM. And, you know, you got to collect data and then you've got to figure out what it means. And so the first thing you have to figure out is what are you going to ask? So the question is often more important than the problem. Getting the right questions is more important than the problem you're trying to solve.
Oh,
And or it's the key to it. And then I used to just love listening to people, you know, tell me what was going on in their business, what's really happening. I was dealing with the organization side, so the people side of it. It was not technology at all. It was the people side. And I, you know, I was it did not always make people happy that my notes were so extensive because I could type really fast and I was just hanging on every word. We didn't have transcription services. But when you find that anecdote from someone that really brings your business conclusion alive, then you know, it's and your recommendation starts to sound like it's going to affect somebody's work every day, you know,
Yeah.
then that's like, and I was thinking about that and comparing it to what you did with law, where you were gathering all this data. I'm sure you had to talk to people to find out what there was, you know, going on. Did you get that same sense of the storytelling when you were doing stuff that was on the legal side?
Oh, yeah, I think, yeah, when you were talking, I thought of, it wasn't a consulting job, it was a research for the National Institute of Justice. And what we were doing, my colleagues and I, there were 3 of us, we went around the country and we interviewed prosecutors, and what we were trying to do was to you know, determine, how do you decide, first of all, do you ever prosecute corporations and corporate executives? What criteria do you use to, you know, whether to prosecute, what obstacles are there, and so forth and so on. And boy, the stories we heard then, you know, were just amazing, and examples of, you know, the obstacles that existed, whether they were resource or political, or, you know, all kinds of possible obstacles. The frustrating part was that very often, particularly when we were in New York City, almost anything at the least bit sensitive, I mean, I wouldn't even consider it sensitive, but the guy would, before he answered the question, he'd point to the tape recorder and say, you know, "God, turn it off."
Oh,
So a
uh-huh.
lot of the best stuff never got into the reports. But no, you're absolutely right. And even in consulting, of course, you're dealing with, it may sound cut and dried, you know, corporate white collar crime, but it always involves people. And what they felt they owed to the corporation, what the rewards were within an organization, you know, either explicit or implicit. And learned so much about, you know, the application of what seemed to be pretty dry laws to corporate settings. So yeah, absolutely. And of course, the project I described here, in talking with the residents of, you know, retirement center and health centers, if you sat down and really allowed people, and if they felt comfortable, allowed people to tell their stories, there was rarely a person that I talked with that there wasn't something that was truly fascinating that you never would have guessed this person was involved in. And the personalities of people come out, I think, best when they're telling stories, rather than describing, you know, what kind of person they are. It's, you know, and we used to, I think it might have been Professor Thompson that talked about, you know, the way we transmit our moral values, whether it's a family or an organization, even a corporation, is not really through the rules that we set. It's through the stories we tell, and the examples of, you know, what gets rewarded, what doesn't, what, you know, where boundaries were established or transgressed. But it really comes out in those stories. That's really how moral values are transferred at least most efficiently that way. So I don't know if
Well,
that. makes any
Professor
sense.
Thompson was, my Professor Thompson experience was like your Dick Griffiths experience. He's the guy who dropped my grade a day for every day the paper was late.
Uh-huh.
And my lowest grades were from professors who did that.
We remember those things, don't we?
Oh, yeah. Transgressions, definitely.
That's right. Well, I probably was somewhat of a grade grubber at that time. You know, I knew I wanted to go to, or at least I thought I wanted to go to law school at that time. And doggone it, that's going to hurt my chances, you know, all of that stuff. But it's sometimes my wife and I have a phrase say, it makes certain things make for better stories than they do experiences. And that's for sure.
Jim, I see that you raised your hand.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I see that
Okay,
little hand up.
amazing. Bill, one of the greatest storytellers I ever met, his name was Lawrence Holofcener. I met him when he was 87 years old. Quickly, he served in occupied Japan after World War II, went on to the University of Wisconsin, then headed to Broadway to write music with Jerry Bach. Does that name ring a bell? Fiddler on the Roof?
Yeah. Tell me a little more about him, Jerry Bach.
So anyway, Lawrence was restless, and he was very good at writing music and composing. He separated peacefully, amicably from Jerry Bach. Jerry went on to write Fiddler on the Roof. Lawrence starred as Tevye in one of the first rounds of Fiddler on the Roof. But Lawrence was probably one of the most cultured individuals I've ever met. He decided he didn't like writing music. He wanted to move on to writing books. He decided he wanted to write plays when he got restless doing that. He was an actor and he performed. And then in his late 40s, he started doing sculpture, and he's most famous for doing sculptures. He did a sculpture of Churchill and Roosevelt sitting on a bench. It sits on Bond Street in London. It's the most famous sculpture in all of the UK because it shows Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill life-size commiserating on a bench. At age 85, he did a 5-minute video, and it's out there on the website, called Growing Bolder, From Broadway to Bus. And he talks about his lifestyle of moving on and don't be afraid to take on new challenges. He said, you never retire. And so it's kind of giving a life's advice at age 85. So if you've got a few minutes sometime, go on the website, Google Growing Bolder or Broadway to Bus, Lawrence Holofcener, Holofcener. At age 89, he asked if he could convert my book to a play, a stage play. And of course I thought, I don't know if he'll survive to do it, but I thought, what the heck, why not? And he got into about 4 iterations of the play, and he had a stroke and couldn't finish it. So his wife took it under her wing and searched out a London playwright who's written a lot of plays, BBC, and he went on to complete the play. But that's a fantastic individual. He's the most amazing man I've ever met. And he was a wonderful storyteller, just like you, Bill.
What a great story. Yeah, I've got to look up that sculptor too. That I'm really fascinated by that. So Growing Bolder, Broadway to Bust, and then is that sculpture in that video, or is that separate?
Yes.
Okay.
And if you Google Allies, ALLIES, you'll see several websites come up that will take you to the sculpture.
Okay. Oh, great. Wonderful.
In fact, his widow just sold one of the 5 or 7 remaining sculptures, and she's using all that money to underwrite the stage play. But she's about 10 years younger, so she still has a lot of energy.
Oh, that's great. That is great. You know, I was going to also mention that one of the best pieces of advice that my wife gave me upon retirement was to take some time to say no. because I know that might sound like it flies completely in the face of, this, being in your community, but sometimes you need, you need to reflect on really what you do want to do. And it sounds like, forget if it was Alice or Judy, you talked about your first couple years, you were not quite sure what you wanted to do. And that may have been very productive time. It may have not felt like it, but again, I think we do need time to catch our breath and to find, because our life rhythm is completely different at that time. And a very, very dear friend of mine, as long as I'm thinking of good advice that I was given, I remember it was a pretty difficult time dealing with some family issues and health issues on a couple of different fronts. A very tough time for me. And I was seeking this friend out to spend some time talking. And I was still working at this time. And I was describing all of the things that I was trying to continue to do, but yet, needed to spend time with the person that had health and so forth, family. And he kind of stopped, he listened. And then he said, Bill, he says, sometimes you talk about balancing all of these things in your life. He said, I get a sense that you're, walking along a tightrope trying to juggle. And he said, you might want to think in terms of trying to find all this stuff to balance in your life. Think more in terms of finding a rhythm in your life. And finding a rhythm means that you have to prioritize things, because finding a rhythm means you have to give time to those things. And so if you make certain things a part of the rhythm in your life, rather than just adding more and more stuff to juggle in the life. And as simple as that sounds, that really had an impact on me. And I did find that I was just trying to juggle too many things at that point in time. And it really required me to sit back and say, okay, at this point in time, I need to dedicate more time to this and less time to this. That can wait. But feeling in your gut that it's part of your life rhythm is more important than, trying to do as much as you possibly can.
Great, thanks, Bill. We have a couple of question and a comment in the chat right now. Sally Smith says, my sister has benefited greatly with her dementia with our singing together songs from our childhood. Have you considered using music as a healing aspect for memory challenges?
I haven't specifically targeted that, but a friend of mine has. He has. I'm not, and I really do believe there's healing going on, emotional healing, if nothing else. And what he does is goes specifically into the memory care unit, which is pretty sizable. And he would take a record player and he would play albums of old, say, swing music from the 30s and 40s. Duke Ellington, Glenn Miller, the ones that were most popular during that time, and both vocal and non-vocal. And he engages the memory care people and the memory care, like any other health issue, a wide range of issues within the memory care. And but he was amazed at how interactive people, not everybody, but so many people became, even if it was simply, for some people, tapping their feet, other people singing along with the words. And so he has made a regular, regular visits to the memory care And he feels it's, and certainly the institution itself, the healthcare facility, thinks that it's doing wonderful things. A lot of places do have, some of them even have resident music therapy people. Now, again, I live in a small community, Macomb. We don't have, we don't have hugely funded facilities here like you would in, in wealthier areas, perhaps. But which makes this kind of volunteer work even more important. But that's great. Thank you, Sally.
Fantastic. And then Jim posted in the chat as well, Ally sculptures done in 1995 to celebrate 50 years of peace among former enemies. Lawrence Holofcener.
Okay, there's the spelling. I see
Yeah.
that. Holofcener. Yeah, boy, that's a hard one to pronounce.
That
Isn't it?
is.
Well, Jim, thank you very much.
Awesome. Are there any other questions or comments? Oh, Alice, let's see.
There we go.
You come across a story collection from patients in hospice. The organization that helped my mother-in-law had some volunteers doing that.
Oh, I have not, but I haven't really researched that. But that would be a fascinating project for somebody to do. I did for a time, was trained in hospice, and I think I only went out to 3 different patients, and then my own mother's health dropped precipitously, and I just couldn't do it. That was one of those kind of life rhythm. Rather, I tried to do both, but it was just too much. I was dealing with sadness at home, when you're with your own mother and so forth. And it just, I didn't have the energy, didn't have the focus to go out and do that work with justice. But boy, that'd be absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. Vicki, I see that you got your hand raised.
Yes. Hello. I'm driving a 1994 Honda Accord. It's going to be 27 years old, and it may be time for a new car. And it got me thinking about how many more years do I have to drive? I don't think my next car needs to last 27 years.
This woman's driving a 1994 Honda.
Yeah, it's a good car. I almost bought a Saturn at that time, but I went with the Honda, and I'm so glad. Anyway, so this question has to do with facing our mortality. We're all coming up around the 70-year milestone, and give or take a few years, and we know that we're not going to live forever. And it makes every week, every month, every year that much more precious. But one thing that I thought about that could be an important thing for me to do in the time I have left is family genealogy and writing the stories of our family for the next generation, for the grandchildren and their children, and so on and so forth.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But
well, one
you
thing.
do you have any other thoughts on, facing our mortality and how to put closure on our lives and make our lives more meaningful?
Well, I think your idea of collecting those stories, if that's what you're talking about doing, rather than just, developing the lines of descent and so forth. But one thing I would emphasize, and because I did get people after this project, after I, self-published that little book with all these stories, people came up with, well, are you going to continue? There are more people who want to tell their stories, or, or said, what can I do? Can you give me some advice to do it? And I don't have the money to, publish a little book or whatever. And what I ended up advising them was that, it doesn't need to be a book. You can simply buy, and the recording devices are so much cheaper and so much better than they ever were before, the digital, which is what I use, just a little, handheld, put it on the table. It was wonderful. Is you collect those stories and put them either online or on a CD. And I wish I had something like that for my own parents, to have heard their stories. And if you know, and I know I'm guilty of this myself in my 70s now, that, oh yeah, we've heard that story before, so, but even though it may be repeated, to hear it in the voice of that relative, of that mother, that father, that grandmother, whoever it is really priceless. So it might be easier than you think to go out and record, and rather than having to transcribe it and, reduce it to print, that can be a very, very valuable and very, accessible kind of thing to do.
Absolutely. Personal story with that, going off of that, my husband's grandfather is still living. He's 95 years old, and they last year recorded him talking about his time in World War II.
Yeah.
And they've heard stories before, but once he was in front of the camera, they heard even more detail and story that they've never heard from him before. And he's very quiet, but just being in front of the camera and it really opened him up. And they'll have that video forever to cherish. And my husband uses it in his history class. He's a history teacher for high school students. He's able to share those stories even outside of our family. And it's great.
That's beautiful. And and that generation, they were, I think, pretty notorious for, depending on their experiences, of not talking about it a lot. So, you just don't know what's going to trigger it. My father-in-law, who was World War II Navy, he would not talk about it, but one of his grandkids, and the one that ended up in music theater, as it turns out. So she's got that kind of outgoing personality. In fact, she was pulled off, but she's starting up again in September. But she was touring, those of you familiar with Hamilton, she's playing Angelica in the national tour of Hamilton. Well, when she was much younger, she showed a lot of interest talking to grandpa about his experiences other than farming. And so he was in the Navy in World War II, and it took her sitting him down at the table with that bubbly personality of hers. And all of a sudden, she had stories coming out, and everybody else started coming in and wanting to listen because they'd never heard him talk like that before. So you just don't know when the time is right, but you've got to try.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, I don't see any other questions or comments in the chat. Does anybody have anything else before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think I should find a retirement home that has a DJ on staff.
There you go.
There you go.
That's perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody so much for joining us this afternoon. We have one more event this evening, and that is our virtual happy hour. So I hope everybody can join us. The links are located on the Monmouth College website under alumni and then Golden Scots. And then tomorrow, our last event for the weekend will be a virtual chapel service that's taking place in Dahl Chapel. So I hope everybody can join us for that as well. Other than that, thank you so much, everybody. And I hope to see you in about an hour. Go Scots.
Well,
Thanks to all of you. I really enjoyed this. I appreciate it.
Good to see you again, Bill.